like, does your mother know where you are? And it really just, much like with soldiers, which you're like, man, these are 20-year-olds fighting these wars. We have 20 and 30-year-olds and some young, 40 and 50-year-olds, but generally speaking, they're young and they do a marvelous job. It's very reassuring, certainly to me.
Yeah. And it's all, I mean, a great thing also for us, kind of the reactions we're getting. The publishers always put these things out for blurbs, and sometimes people write back, and a lot of times they just string a few adjectives together. But like Sanjay Gupta, I mean, who is still in hospitals a lot, and he wrote back, and I mean, we didn't think he would, and he just said, it's just what's captured here. It's beautiful, and then Sebastian Junger, I don't know if you know him, but he wrote The Perfect Storm. He's a really, really, really good writer. And this was the first blurb he got back. And he said that it was one of the most moving things he'd ever read. And he said he devoured it. And when he was done, he said that he was changed forever, which is an amazing thing to hear from anybody, but especially a writer that you really respect and is just a real craftsperson. And to have that kind of effect, which is, once again, I'd like to take credit for the language, but it's other people, it's you guys, it's the nurses.
Yeah. Do we have anybody have any questions? I was hoping that we were going to get some from the audience.
I don't know how to work this chat room, so you're looking at the wrong guy here. But while you're waiting, Chris, I would just toss out, this idea, this book too, when we kind of say, what's it like to be, a nurse for a day? What's it like to be you for a day? And you more and more when you talk to these nurses and you realize it's more than just a ER story. It's more than just learning about the gore of the emergency room or whatever. It's really, I think it's even deeper. It's about these very heroic men and women that are quite selfless in their service, that are, no matter how you slice it, no matter what got them into this profession, at some point there's this intersection of desire and mission, and it's like soldiers, they're so committed, and point out,
there was one nurse, he was having trouble getting, he knew he wanted to do it, but he couldn't get in, and the way he got in, he just kept pestering, and finally he just wrote this letter, and he said, I will do anything, I will lick the floors in your hospital, give me a chance, because I know this is what I was meant to do. And that's that kind of passion to both, to make it happen, and then to deliver. We're talking to somebody today about this whole thing, and he said that every once in a while you see somebody who's in it for the paycheck, but he said it's rare. He says it's rare.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we all need to be paid for the job that we do, but I don't think that isn't what entices nurses to go into nursing. I don't think there's any question about it.
There was an article recently just saying that a huge percentage of the people believe that nurses are really drastically underpaid and underappreciated for sure. And hopefully, and also a lot of things, I mean, as Matt, you can talk a little bit about PTS and whatever with the military, where it's really recognized that it's a huge problem, and people are trying to do something about it. But with your profession, I think people are just like, well, just be tough. They're not doing as much about it as maybe needs to be done.
Yeah, Chris, it was very, very apparent to me. 20 years of warfare, we were still had folks deployed in Afghanistan when we started this book, and certainly on the Horn of Africa and everything. But for 20 years, we've been talking about soldiers, mental and emotional wellness, and it's become very common, and I mean common and accepted. Let's take care of our soldiers with post-traumatic stress. Let's get the stigma and all the other cliches out. And so here, as I'm talking to these young men and women of all ages in the ER, and I'm listening, you can feel the heavy burden that they're holding. And as Jim said, they're just driving on, head down, carry that heavy load and move forward. And I'm like, time out, man. This is, no, why aren't we talking? And it got to the point I finally asked, like, hey, how are you all, dealing with this? Because you can't keep it all bottled up. Again, look at the military. We learned that's bad. And,
Right.
so many of them were like, well, we have an ERB or we have a whatever. And again, tonight's not the night to beat up on, the wellness plan at a hospital, but it is something I think that needs to be considered and certainly should be addressed when we think about what we've asked. And I mean, we didn't even get into COVID when we started this. We were decidedly not talking about COVID.
Right. Right.
I mean, Jim's guidance, he's like, we don't want it to be the COVID book. We want to talk
When
about
we did the interviews, that was the last thing we talked about with anybody.
Yeah. And
With
so
COVID,
then, you just sprinkle that on top, and I'll shut up in a sec, but when you sprinkle COVID on top of all the other car wrecks, gunshots, burns, child abuse, you name it, that
Right.
ER nurses are dealing with, it's like, we got to take care of them. So anyway, I don't mean to go down that hole too far.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting thing, and hopefully it'll be, one of the things that the book helps to do, just draw more attention to that. And even in nursing schools, I think this is a really good textbook. I think it's great for kids to read this thing who are in, in school. With the other book, the combat book, it's being taught at West Point now, which is great. Yeah.
That is great. Now, I would agree. I think, like I said before, you really nailed it when you put all of this together and these nurses told all of their stories. It really does. I was always very, very proud to be a nurse. I agree with what you said, that you go in, you get the job done, you think about it later, you have a lot of comrades and, around you that help you get through some of the tough times. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, and I think from a lot of the nurses that you interviewed, it's all about the job that we do, why we do it, and how we do it. And there's a reason we do it, right? Because we are here to save lives, to make people comfortable, to just deal with all of that. And I think your book just really showed from kind of A to Z what nurses do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Which is why I think it's just so compelling.
And there's so many people who go through life and try to just look for some meaning, that they want their life to be meaningful. They want to have meaning. And I do think that most nurses, there is meaning. They know
Yes.
they're helping people. They know there's meaning to that. And we even talk about in terms of the military, where when you're over in the war zone, there's meaning to your life. You're protecting the people on the other side of you. You're dealing with, sometimes some bad people on the other side, and there's some real meaning, which is one of the reasons when people come home, they're like, okay, man, what happened? Because that meaning is gone now. Now I've got to find it back here in America, and I'm not sure where to start. And that's one of the things that gets people confused, some people, when they come back from a war zone.
Right. One of the things that I was really happy that you talked about too was flight nursing, because that's not talked about that much. And again, in a flight nurse situation, you get into a helicopter, you get into a jet, and you fly to where you need to go to pick up a patient. And then no matter how sick they are, you're trying to keep them resuscitated and doing well as they're in the aircraft, landing at the hospital that they need to be at to be taken care of. So I was very appreciative of the fact that you covered all of, from nurses, from the bedside, kind of all the way through. That I think that really told us a story. It also tells a story about how nurses don't do the same thing every day. In fact, if you look at their stories, every day is different, and every patient is different. And I'm sure, I think there's a lot of questions that are going to be coming up that hopefully you guys are going to be able to listen to. It's at the end of a day, it's always, we might be exhausted, we might be stressed out, but at the end of the day, that you've made a difference every day.
Yeah.
And not every job can say that, right? Where
No,
they've
there's
made
a
the
lot of
claim that
jobs that
they-
can't say it.
and know, right, and know that
Yeah,
they've made a difference.
Yeah, for a
So
lot of
maybe we,
people, the meaning is my family. That's the meaning in their life. And for a lot of people, the job, it doesn't, but that's a wonderful thing about nursing. Most nurses say, it brings meaning to my life.
right, right.
You know, Chris, just real quick before you switch over, I just got to throw this in. You know, when I was doing some of these interviews, and you kind of get on the flight nurse track, and of course,
Right.
when you got a buddy, and so there was like I couldn't get away from flight nurses for a while. What was interesting, just because of the military piece, I'm like, that's pretty cool, the air medevac. But what's interesting to me too was that when I kind of got back to the ER, physically those that are working
Right.
in the ER, and how many of them said, and listen, you're like, oh my gosh, you guys are heroes. And then you say, like, I could never do that. I could never be the one at 2 a.m. that has to go out to, the lower 40 to find this tragic accident victim and deal with him or her in the freezing rain, cold. Then, everything you just described, put them on a helicopter, fly through a storm, and then bring them back just so we can be back. And literally, I think one of them said, in our warm, cozy ER. So that flight nurse piece was really, really interesting. Just again, another subset of this trauma
And
world.
one of the things, there's so much like rich detail in terms of, and that's what gets people to really wake up and understand. Like when there's talking about being at a party, I don't know if it's a costume party or kids party, and she's dressed up like a lion in a onesie, and suddenly somebody has an incident and she has to deal with it in her lion onesie, that kind of thing. Or another nurse talking about anytime she's out in a church or in a restaurant, whatever, she's always kind of looking around, wondering if such and such, that person looks like they're a little under the weather, and if she had to act, and you know what I mean? And that just brings it alive for people in terms of, okay, I get it. The combat boots walk in my combat boots, and to some extent, this thing could have been called, walk in my ER,
Right.
because you're understanding it. You're walking in somebody else's shoes. You're getting it.
Well, now I'll just tell you kind of a quick story. We belong to a Lutheran church that have a lot of people that are older, and both my husband was a paramedic firefighter, and me as a nurse. There were a number of times when somebody would slump over in the pew, somebody would grab their chest, somebody would do whatever, and either Tom or I were up and out.
Yeah.
Having somebody call the medics as we're getting to the patient and making sure that we're, getting them taken care of. So you're totally right. Even if you're off shift, you still, and even me retired now, I still have that. Go get it, right? Go see what you can do.
We're making a joke today, because Captain Kirk is going up in the.
Oh, he did.
We were making the joke that, because they had a few other people, we said, we hope one of them is an emergency room nurse.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it looked like he had a good time.
Yeah, he seemed to be enjoying life, which is great.
Yeah, exactly. So, how many of these have you done, and how much advertising are you doing for your book?
Well, I think we talked to over 100 people. I think there are 57 that we wound up in the book,
Right.
Advertising. I don't, they're doing some online. I'm not exact. I know there was an ad in the New York Times today. So I don't, they do some. I mean, all the advertising online, all it's supposed to do is, there's a book out there.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. You're so well known.
And that book did really well. And now you're still walking. Oh, I didn't know there was such and such a book. It's hard to get information out these days because there used to be, 15 years ago, every newspaper had a book reviewer, and now like none or not many. So it's hard to get information that there's a book out there that you might be interested in, which is, once again, as I said, if you're listening to us tonight and you don't want to read this book, then we messed up somehow, because the stories are wonderful. We didn't communicate that the way we should have.
But Chris, and I, Jim and I were chatting about this.
There's your ad, right?
this morning, and it's come up a couple of times, neither of us, and I'm not speaking for Jim, but I'm just attributing it to this
Yeah.
team. But we couldn't find or think of, in all my kind of snooping around bookstores, a book like this about nurses. There's some medical
Right.
books. There are some out there, and again, not a backhanded compliment to anyone out there that I maybe just didn't see at the local bookstore, but I haven't found a collection of these stories, firsthand accounts from the emergency room anywhere. And again, I think that's one, it's tragic that it hasn't been done. I'm thankful that we got to be, maybe the first ones to do it. But even more grateful that we get to introduce these great men and women to to the world, literally. I mean, heroes and overused.
Teresa Brown did a nice book that the shift, one nurse, 12 hours, 4 patients' lives. That was a particular. She actually gave us a nice quote for the book too. And obviously there are some, but I think and we kind of lucked into this notion of doing these long interviews and then bringing them into these very digestible stories, and I think it just makes it so much easier to read. And it's interesting with this kind of a book that people will sit there and read it in a weekend.
Because I read it in a day. It in a day. Yeah, because the stories are so real, they're so touching, and again, they tell a great story about what nurses do every day.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of people that are commenting and saying that they've already ordered your book. They're getting it ordered. It's going to be on its way. Lots of comments about how excited they are to read it, to really to sit at the meat of it. So that's good. And like I said, it was funny when I first read this book, James, because I didn't see you as being somebody who would write about nurses. Right. I was like, wow, have I missed some of the books that he's read or that he's written? But then once you get going and you see it, you can see, and just like you've said today, exactly why it is you went down this path.
Yeah. Well, I write a lot of kids' books. I mean, there's a lot of things people don't, get about what I do. But I write, I think actually my best books are my kids' books, and they all tend to be pretty funny. So it's, whatever, people do their own, whatever the heck. But yeah. You kind of get like, oh, Alice Cross, those things can be violent. Yeah, I do those. Kids' books, not violent.
No.
Yeah.
But again, I think that this book tells a story that really has not been told the way that you're doing it.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much. And that really means the most to us when somebody who because you know the reality.
Right.
And it's a funny thing. Even and I'm sure you've run into this, and I certainly have. You'll see a newspaper account on where you actually know what happened. You're going like, what?
Right.
There's nothing to do with the reality. Right. And there it is on the front page of such and such a newspaper. And it's like it's masquerading as reality and truth. And a lot of times it isn't. And I've seen that again and again and again about things. You go like, no, that's not what happened. And I'm sure Matt, I mean, you read some of these stories about what's going on in a war zone. You go like, no. No, that's what it is. But with this thing, and we are getting a lot of that. This is the real deal. This is real. This is what's happening.
Well, and I don't think it will take people long to start reading these stories and to understand that it really is coming from the heart and it really is happening. And the nurses are doing a really good job of telling this story. And in fact, in my situation, I could almost close my eyes and just live with them through some of what they were saying, because the book has just been written so well.
Well, thank you. This is we love hearing this stuff, man. No, from people that really know,
Right.
And Chris, it truly is, it's such a noble profession. And I don't use that term lightly because, as a career infantryman, couple of deployments, that was very, very passionate about that job and the mission. And sometimes, I'd get my blinders on and think it's just, the military that really has the handle on, this selfless service. And, you just sort of think like, yeah, the medical community, and in particular, you bring it down to the nurses, just sort of part of the infrastructure. When you start talking to them, you realize, man, there's so much more. And
Right.
I would hope that this would inspire young men and women of all ages, to consider this, because again, it's just as dynamic as an environment. It's a place for go-getters. It's not for
Right.
wallflowers. It's
Right.
you got to go out and kind of kick ass and take names. Pardon me, but it's not for the weak and faint-hearted. And we need men and women to be comfortable in those uncomfortable situations. I just found myself captivated and looking forward to each interview that I was going to do, because it's like, I'm going to hear not only a cool story, but I'm going to meet another person that's just ready to go out and take on the world, and that's pretty motivating.
And I think the other thing too about nursing is that that every day is different patients, different stories, different situations. I mean, even when you're in the intensive care unit and you come back day after day after day to the same patient, there's different things that happen and different things that go on. So it's always so dynamic. And I guess at the end of the day, if you can help save a life, it makes a big difference. It means a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And you guys, I mean, the doctor, a lot of times will see a patient for 5 or 6 or 7 minutes.
Right.
And you guys are there, it's all day or all month, or you know what I mean? It's a very meaningful thing. Yeah.
I didn't know, I didn't know what, or I guess I didn't particularly understand until I listened and then saw the advocacy that nurses do take on that role for their patients. We think you go in and you get fixed and you're off, and you're like, no, there's a lot that goes on once you get through those 2 swinging doors. And that doggone emergency room nurse is your, she's your everything, and he or she is your everything. They're gonna go that sometimes they're gonna get into it with a physician. It's gonna be doggone, a fight, maybe even physically, but literally and figuratively, they're gonna have words on your behalf, because that's what that nurse does. And I had no idea until we started talking to them. And I think again,
I think it'll change people's hospital experience too. Something comes up again and again and again is, some patient who would ask for water 15 minutes earlier and they're all in a tizzy and they don't realize where that nurse just was, like maybe saving life or something, big stuff. And they'll apologize, you're sorry about the water, but it's complicated here.
Yeah, no, you're right. But again, I think every story that was told tells a little bit more about what nurses really do. And so I'm hoping that nurses, like I said, through this chat that I'm seeing, there's people that are ordering this book like crazy, which is a really great thing. I think it's also would be really good to get it into some of the School of Nursing. Yeah. Right. I'm just thinking about the university and the School of Nursing, and it wouldn't, that would just be one idea for something that if nurses to be, or if you're wondering about being a nurse or you want to share some of the information, it really does tell the true story of what it means to be a nurse.
I had, and just the way we're talking here, I was just thinking that, a lot of people have the book clubs. This is a really interesting book club book.
Yes.
Because there's a lot to talk about. You get a novel and you can talk, but sometimes you really got to strain to really, but this thing, man, you're off and you're talking, and it's emotional and it's really loaded. And I don't know, to me, it's an interesting thing for a book club to talk about.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but you're exactly right. This would really be a good discussion topic for a book club, because it does talk about so many things. It talks about the family side, it talks about the patient side, it talks about the nurse side, talks about what happened, what's going to happen, what the end of it was. So that's actually another great thing to pursue, or the book clubs. Well, what other comments do you all have? I think this has been great. Again, I can't say enough about what a great book I think it is and how touching it is. And I think when people decide to read it, they just need to take a deep breath to begin with and head on. And like me, I could hardly put it down. So I think the more that we can talk about it, the more we can share with other people, the better it will be. And again, if I'm looking correctly, there's a lot of people today that are already putting in orders for your book. So that's great.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting, and maybe part of it is just hearing the stories. I mean, this really has become a passion project for us. Today we did our first interview at 6 a.m. and we were supposed to actually have one at midnight. So that's been our day today. And the old line from Lethal Weapon or whatever, I'm getting too old for this shit. But here we are, man, and we really are. We are very passionate about these stories.
Yeah. Well, and again, it was obvious by the conversation we've had with you, but and just as good about even reading the book or even having people tell you about the book. I think even word of mouth will make more and more people read it. And I think it's good for people to know and understand what really does go on behind, I don't want to say the closed doors, but once you get to that emergency department or once you get to wherever it is, and all the number of people that work with you to do what they can to make you better and to help you get to where it is you need to get. So I think it's, I love the book. Was so glad that I was able to be the moderator for this. I was hoping we were going to have some questions and answers. I'm not sure what's happened there, but you guys are awesome and you've done a great job. Actually, somebody just said, can we make this mandatory reading? Sure.
Yeah.
I actually have some questions for the audience that I think will be very interesting. Lori Wild mentioned, based on what both you, Matt, and James learned, what advice would you give policymakers about support for the nursing practice so far as funding, reimbursement, scope of practices? And also, Chris, you can also.
I'm going to throw this to Chris because a little, no, because we know what we've heard from nurses about their lives, but the things that, just as Matt knows a lot of the things in terms of the military that should be happening because he's been dealing with that, since he came back. But Chris, I mean, you at least start us on this one because you do know some things that would be helpful for people in government and elsewhere to be dealing with. Certainly, schools, and I know it's hard and there can be legal constraints and whatever, but in terms of more real world preparation for people, that would be useful. We see that again and again. And in this book, you'll hear a lot. Nursing school didn't prepare us. Not that the nursing schools are bad, but they didn't prepare us for the emergency room. Matt was talking about what were you saying about
no one ever gives an IV on a real person until they're actually, in the hospital.
And in the service, Matt was saying that they would do it, with buddies so that they would be prepared to, if it happened out in the field, At any rate, but I'm sorry, Chris, but yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say that it's been a lot of years since I went through nursing school. So you just have to remember that. I'm not really up to what's all going on now. I can tell you, actually, somebody just said nothing prepares you for the ER. And I would agree with that, especially if you're in a trauma center like Harborview. Nursing school taught us a lot and we worked really hard.
Sure.
We got to deal with the real patients, but usually not the really sick patients when we were in nursing school. But I think what happens when you get out and you go to an emergency department, and I happen to love the emergency department. I was I don't want to say the worse, the better, because you never want a patient to be worse or sick, but the variety was really important to me. And that boom, 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 you got to get moving, right? You can't sit around and try to think about this and put out your, read in a book about it. You really need to get moving with it. And I think what people find is either they love emergency nursing and that's what they want to do, or they are more of a bedside nurse, right? Where they don't need to be They don't need to be jumping into the fire the entire
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Most of us ER nurses are fire jumpers, right? We want to get in and get going and you know, and make a lot of things happen. And I'm not sure that we as nurses do the job that adrenaline junkies is what Sammy Sue Anderson just said. Exactly. We are adrenaline junkies. I mean, that's true. It was always hard for me to have it be a quiet day or a quiet night because I wanted to get moving, right? I had things I wanted to do. I wanted to take care of patients. I wanted to have I wanted to do what you've just put in your book with all these patients. So it does take, I think, a different breed of a person to be a nurse. You can be a nurse in a smaller hospital, it's not so dramatic as it is in a trauma center. You also, another person just said college just doesn't prepare you for this, which is true. College doesn't really prepare you necessarily to once you jump into into a school of nursing. I honestly think that we as nurses need to do a better job advertising the great jobs that we have. And I don't know that we do that. I know that I've talked to a lot of people, for sure. When I was an active nurse, I talked to a lot of people about even thinking about going into nursing. But that's what we need to continue to do. And I don't disagree that people do work really hard. They have long shifts. Sometimes I think they said a couple times in some of your stories that they were barely able to go to the bathroom. They were so busy taking care of patients. And I don't know what the situation is right now, other than there are a lot, there's just not enough nurses to go around, just like there's not a lot of other things to go around. This pandemic has caused such chaos in so many situations. I do think that the schools of nursing need to be well aware of what they're preparing their nurses to be.
Well, I think one of the things about it, because there's so much truth in this thing, it will help people who ought to be doing this to consider, or this is something you really ought to look at. And in some cases, no, that's not for me, and that's good. That's a good thing. Right.
And I think it also, and I think you talked about this in some of the book, is that you have to have, now this another nurse just said, nurses often don't eat or go to the bathroom. That's true. That's another thing that's true too, depending
Eventually they will.
Exactly, depending on the shift that you're on. But I do think that that we need to continue to bolster nursing. We need to talk about how important it is. We need to to recognize the nurses for what they're doing. And that's exactly what you've done in this book. And so I, as a retired nurse, absolutely appreciate everything that's been put in this book, because I think it really does tell the story of what nurses do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Awesome.
And then I have another question from Amy Goodlow. This is directed at both James and Matt. How does writing a book like this compare to your other genres, fiction? What was your approach as far as research went in gathering these stories?
Well, we didn't have to do it. The research was the interviews. I mean, you do the interviews, and there's no research for this. You just do the interviews, and then Matt, as I said, would do most of the interviews, and then I would try to, or well, we both would, and actually another guy worked with us too, turn these into these 4, 5, 6 page. Because we just thought that would be easier for people to digest and get through, and it'll make for a better reading experience for people. But this isn't a research book.
No.
And then another question here directed.
But that's what people do when they research. They go out and talk to people.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's the research. So yeah, the research is you go out and talk to 100 nurses, and then you write up what they say.
Right.
And then this is another question directed at Chris. As you mentioned before, Amy again mentioning, knowing that you have retired, looking back, what are some of the things you wish you knew getting into nursing at the beginning that you know now?
Oh, wow. I started out in working in a pediatric hospital, and 30 some years ago, where things were very different back then than they are now. We didn't have the autonomy that I think that nurses have now. We didn't have, certainly medicine has just done nothing but advance every, year and so there's a lot, as I was reading these stories, there's just, I think, a lot more, there's a lot more tools in the toolbox to take care of these patients, which I think is really exciting. I also think that, that we need to continue to encourage people to go into nursing, because I agree. I don't think there's enough nurses. I don't think that there's probably enough emergency nurses. And we don't do a very good job of advertising ourselves.
And then would you, another person here, Amy Barrow wanted to know, I teach high school and work with seniors interested in this profession. Would you recommend they read this book?
Yeah, totally, man. Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's hard to imagine a book that would be better for kids in high school to read because it's real. It's very readable. And that's a big thing with kids, man. You have to give them something. They consider their time and their right to some level to be precious. And you want to give them books that they're gonna keep reading because they want to read it, and they're gonna, and they're interested in the truth. They want to know. They want honesty. They want truth. So this is absolutely perfect book for kids in high school to read as they're thinking about what do I want to do when I grow up.
Right. I agree. Yeah, I agree.
I wish there were more books like this for other professions. It'd be
Right.
great to have one. Okay, what do lawyers really do? What do yeah, okay, now I can, and you'd like to, and unfortunately with, a lot of the guidance counselor thing, they don't know, they don't know enough to really be knowledgeable about the stuff. So here's one for nurses. There'd be great one to, what do doctors really do? What do lawyers really do? What do accountants really do? That'd be great for kids. So, but in this
case, James,
yeah.
So there you go. Now you go and write. Now you do one about doctors.
Right.
A new series.
Accountants there. That'll be a bestseller.
No.
So I guess a final word from Julie Murphy. This is very fascinating. Thank you, Chris, for your work as an ER nurse, and Matt and James for taking the time to write this book. I simply cannot wait to read it. I wish I could have read it before this evening so I could bring some questions. Thank you. And for all the other frontline workers and nurses, thank you even more so. And I think that's a good note to leave off on. And I'm going to address the general audience for a second. Did you want a final word, anyone?
No,
Okay.
This was great. This is a wonderful, and Chris, you were spectacular as always.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for attending tonight's discussion and for supporting an independent bookstore. We hope that you join us again. Links for ER nurses are included on our event page. I would also like to thank personally Matt, James, and Chris for attending this event this evening. And thank you and good night.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you
Thank
both.
you.
You guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thanks. Jim, have a good night.
You too, Matt. See you tomorrow morning.
Yeah.